Hello, and welcome to our talk on class, socioeconomic status, and schools. As we move into this module, some learning outcomes that we will explore will be connected to thinking about the class structures and the factors that actually contribute to the distinct class divisions that we see in our communities. We'll also outline the 5 factors that contribute to individuals and family SES status. And then we'll talk a little bit about being able to define how we see those different classes and the experiences of students in the connection to how we make sense of their families, and also infer how that designation has implications on how students ultimately experience their schooling realities. So thinking more intentionally around how we make sense of the identity in connection to class and how that translates then into schooling experiences. As we talk and work through this module, as always, we will start with a common understanding of what I am referring to when I reference class. So what is class? I chose to use the definition offered by Anderson and Collins that suggests that class is actually best understood as a system that differentially structures groups' access connected to economic, political, cultural, and social resources. Oftentimes we think about class and we don't account for those different aspects, but it's very important to note that when we're referencing class identity in this module and within this course, that we're attending to a group's access in connection to not only economic resources, but also thinking about political, cultural, and social connections as well. As we're attending to class and how we see it show up, there are 2 main perspectives connected to the viewpoints on class structures. The first being those that accept the existing kind of socioeconomic levels that we know that are persistent in society. Typically, these perspectives align with the notion that there's opportunities for social mobility for individuals in certain class structures. And so you have this ability to move into higher classes after you finish college if you work really hard. Also on this first perspective of class structure, there are thoughts that individuals who have not been able to achieve upper and middle class status are often seen as not trying as hard or being less capable, right? And so the reasoning behind why that individual or why a certain person or certain community has not been able to kind of be socially mobile in the class system is because they haven't worked as hard as others. And oftentimes in this perspective, in connection to thinking about viewpoints in class structure, there's this notion that the hardship that is faced often by those in the lower classes is blamed on their lack of connection to certain middle class values and behaviors, right? And so it centers this notion that the fault of where you exist within the class structure is individually based, okay? The other perspective, most dominant perspective that we understand when we're thinking about viewpoints in class is this perspective that there are very strict and distinct class divisions that are often recognized in many of the societal spaces that we exist, right? This perspective also aligns with the idea that individuals and families that own or control corporations, banks, systems, and that nature, institutions in that connection, often hold the production of how we see um, certain aspects of class systems persisting, and typically are who compromise or who comprise the privileged upper class, right? So there's a group of individuals and families that hold the majority of the power in connection to thinking about corporation control, banks, etc. The means of production that are associated with how the majority exists in society. So how we assess and access certain aspects of resources in society is controlled by a nucleus of individual and family power. Also, from this perspective, there's a connection to thinking about people having to earn their living by primarily having to sell their labor in order to persist in this class system, right? So this idea that you have to be willing to work in order to ascribe to certain aspects of middle and working class identities And that is in that orchestration of selling their labor that you're able to attempt to acquire the status that aligns with middle and working class identities. So there's a connection between those two, because the previous sentiment or perspective was around those that hold the power, the corporations, the institutions, the banks, etc., that comprise the upper middle class, the upper class. And then there's the group of people that primarily have to sell their labor in connection to those modes of power in order to sustain and connect to their class identities. And in this perspective, in the opposite realm of how we made sense of the first viewpoint around class structure, is this idea that although there are some individuals that do move from one class level to another, oftentimes those opportunities for social mobility are extremely limited. And so there are these two very distinct kind of viewpoints that often undergird conversations around class. And it's extremely important, even as I'm sharing, that we think about what we've come to understand and think about when we think about defining class, and how we've seen it either take place or even how we're making sense of our own class identities. And we'll talk about that as we move forward. Most people, when we're attending to class, are caught in what is considered to be a socioeconomic strata in which they are born, right? And so the suggestion from the data and the research would say that most people typically sustain themselves in the same class level that they were ultimately born, because of the political and economic system that sustains them there. So although we know that when we're thinking about ideology, right, what perspectives, what ways of knowing around class that people have, there are these two viewpoints that exist. The data suggests that given those perspectives that folks most align with, the data suggests that most people are typically maintaining their class status connected to how they were born into certain family dynamics. And so we'll unpack that a little bit further as we move throughout this talk. And so a big part of that then is to make sense of this idea of class identity. So now we know the perspectives that align with what class is. We have a common definition of what class means in connection to how we're making sense of it in this module. It's important to think about then how that translates into how people define and think about who they are. And so I wanted to center this conversation on this in this beginning portion of the presentation around class identity and social stratification. Most people oftentimes identify themselves by class. And which for most typically is middle class. That typically is the most common form of identification because it kind of resides in the middle. And we'll talk about the ways in which perspective shifts how we make sense of identifying with whether or not we align with upper class, and how we make sense of how we identify with lower class, right? And why we know that there's a suggestion that most folks just opt to default to wanting to identify themselves as middle class. Even oftentimes in cases where one might not strongly vocalize their connection to a particular class, we still see this connection to the middle class. And it's because of the labels that are connected to those other levels of understanding around class identity. And so that's also extremely important to note as we're thinking about how we see self-identification with class identity, and then how we might even have perceptions around class identity when we see representation from those outside of ourselves. We know that when we're attending to class identity, that oftentimes it's a huge part of how people socially and occupationally connect to a particular component of themselves, and that there are behavior and values associated with where people fare in connection to this aspect of their identity. It's important to note that oftentimes, because there is this sense to connect with a piece of our identity connected to class that might not readily be accurate in how we're defining ourselves, we need to acknowledge the intersection of how we also see people attributing their class identity also to where they feel like they fare in connection to their ethnic identity and all the other, and also other modes of identity, specifically thinking about religious identification, etc., right? And so they don't often at times align that class identity solely on economic circumstances. They're looking at their connection to their class identity from these other groups that they connect with. And so it's important to know, again, how we're making sense of the term class, and then how that translates then into how people make sense of their identity. So social stratification, what am I referencing when I'm talking about social stratification? This is the way then that we know how people rank themselves in connection to that aspect of their class identity. So now that we know that class is made up of more than just economic circumstances, right? Even though it's greatly influenced by that, and we now know there are other things that contribute to that. Social stratification gives us the language to think about how that then comes into play. And so as we're attending to social stratification and class identity, we're looking at the ways in which within our systems, our societies, we rank individuals and families based off of how we see these components of class taking place. Specifically as we're attending to income, education, occupation, wealth, and power in how we see individuals and families in society. And thus inequality ultimately perpetuates itself because of these differential rankings and the division of labor that we often associate with these components of social stratification that we are explicitly and implicitly perpetuating in the spaces that we're in. We'll talk about each of these different kind of tenets as we move forward, but it's extremely important to notice how we have made sense of these aspects of class identity in the experiences that we ultimately have had, particularly attaining to how we, for example, see certain jobs as being more worthy or more important than others or more popular, right? And so we create this hierarchy based off of occupation, and occupation is thus connected to economic circumstances or economic realities, right? And so there's this very fine line that threads these components of class together that has implications for how we engage and how we see this persistent in student experience, and that ultimately translates into how we exist in our social spaces. We also know that as we're tending then to social stratification and how we rank individuals and families based off of these different aspects, that those that hold higher ranking positions when we're attending to class identity oftentimes are connected to wanting to maintain their position and the power connected to it, thus creating a challenge in thinking about disrupting some of the ways that we make sense of these things, because it really forces us to have those of us that might align with those higher ranking positions to disrupt how we've connected very closely to that connection of power that's associated with where we fare on the ranking list. This often also creates challenges around disruption of policies and practices that restrict the chances of thinking about a more equitable model of how we're making sense of experience, which is ultimately the key in establishing and maintaining this system of social stratification that we know that exists in our society. We know that many people in the US receive either high, very high, or low rankings on the social stratification system based off of the characteristics that ultimately that they have no control over, right? And so this is where we pull into the definition of class, right? Thinking about the social, cultural, political, economic aspects of class and how it truly plays itself out, and how we realize how complex class truly is, and that it really is connected to and ingrained very deeply in our society to more than just the economic circumstances of individuals. And then ultimately, because of that, then we embody some of these deficit narratives that underscore how we make sense of these components of stratification that people often don't have control over. And then it just persists. It's cyclical, right? It continues to repeat itself over and over and over again. What do I mean by that? I mean, oftentimes women, people with disabilities, the elderly, children and people of color are often granted very little prestige as we're tending to where we think they fare in class identity based off of those components of social stratification. We also know that when we're attending to these characteristics that often we don't have control over because of how we've systemically seen these things repeat themselves, some of the people in those groups or some groups that we're born into then become the ones that we maintain for our whole life trajectory. And we often just learn to ascribe to the ones that our parents are connected to, right? And so if we are born into a higher ranking socioeconomic position, oftentimes we just embody that and we maintain that, and we don't really or might not even be consciously aware of what that then might mean for those that are born into other circumstances, right? Because we're not challenged to think about that. And then to think about that level of privilege that might align with that privilege that we've been granted in what we've been born into, as an opportunity to potentially disrupt and look for more opportunities for more equitable circumstances. And so this resonates very closely to some of the conversations and thoughts around power and privilege that we unpacked in Module 2. And thinking about the advantages and the privileges that we are born with, and then what that ultimately means around the experiences of the whole, right? So for us to be privileged in aspects of our class identity that we were born into, right, that we didn't necessarily earn, as suggested from the perspective that you can just work really hard and have access to particular resources and things, then there must be those on the other side of the spectrum that are also born into circumstances that they have no control over, but don't have access to advantages and privileges, and have to work through challenging circumstances and situations. And how might we make ourselves more conscious around how that systemically sustains itself, right? In not problematizing the individual, but rather looking for opportunities to disrupt the systemic way that we see social stratification taking place. So let's go a little bit deeper as we're thinking about social stratification now that we have some shared understandings and terms. As I suggested when I talked about social stratification, we know that as we're tending to how we make sense of a person's economic condition, we measure it based off of a criterion that is called a person's socioeconomic status, or SES for short. There are 5 determinants of SES that we assess. And those determinants of SES also are a part of that social stratification process that we talked about on the previous slide. They are connected to occupation, educational attainment, income, wealth, and power. And oftentimes, as we see this in school spaces, educators place their students at specific SES levels based off of observation and not fact, based off of sometimes bias and stereotype and not fact, based off of things that we feel like we might visually see, based off of the way in which the student uses a certain type of language or dialect, based off of their connection to their eligibility for certain support programs and resources like free and reduced lunch. And because of that, then that has implications on how that student or how those children and families experience their educational realities. So let's unpack each of these as we move forward in our understanding of SES. So when I reference income, we know that income is the amount of money earned in wages or salaries throughout a year. So this most typically is what people default to when we talk about a person's SES, socioeconomic status. We are typically attributing it to how we're making sense of their income. And so we know that income is what sets the limit on the general lifestyle that you might have as a family. It's typically what's connected to the general welfare of how you are existing, connected to material possessions, consumer goods, certain luxuries that you're connected to or not, how you're attending to savings, your housing, right, where you might live, your connection to your diet, what you can eat, what you have access to in particular communities and spaces. And when we think about income, we must also think about how this then resonates as we think about components of class identity, in thinking about upper, middle, and lower class identities. We know when we're attending to low income and middle income families, typically when it comes to income, families are barely able to cover expenses, oftentimes living paycheck to paycheck. Meaning, and this oftentimes comes as a shock as you even attending to middle class families, that if they were to lose that source of income, that those families or those individuals might be homeless within a few months of losing that income, because it is their primary source of access for their economic security. We know that those that have higher incomes are able to provide a stronger sense of security for their families, oftentimes being able to cover beyond the basic essentials that we see lower and middle income families being able to align with when it comes to how we're making sense of their earned wages and salaries that exist throughout a year. Wealth. And I like to make sure to make a point here. Oftentimes when I go over income and wealth, students use these terms interchangeably, income and wealth, and they are two very different things. And so when I'm thinking about or discussing wealth, or we're attending to an individual or family member's wealth, we're talking about more than just income and how a person ascribes to a salary over a year. We're talking about savings accounts. We're talking about access to insurance policies. We're talking about corporate stock ownership and property, right? Land, right? We're talking about how wealth gives individuals the provisions necessary to guarantee future income. So income beyond what you might ascribe to in a particular year. And oftentimes, as we're attending to components of wealth, we know that it has the potential to be connected to the production of additional income, right? So it's not solely just what you might get in salary within a year. It's connected to other aspects of that. We know as we're attending to wealth and SES, 40% of U.S. households have either zero or negative wealth. And this number might even be significantly different if we attended to the last couple of years as we look at the economy. We know that the wealthiest 1% of our nation's population has held 1/3 of our nation's wealth, okay? 1% of the nation's population holds 1/3 of our nation's wealth. So this is looking at those large corporations and businesses, your Walmarts, your Hewlett Packards, Toyota, General Mills, these big organizations, these big names, family names that hold and have sales revenue that exceeds our gross national income of many countries, just these different groups alone, right? And so that is what we're referencing when we're attending to wealth. And we know that wealth ensures the type of economic security for its holders that enhances access to power and prestige of those who actually have the wealth, okay? So there's a huge difference between thinking about income and what wealth means and who has access to wealth. Wealth gives greater opportunities for economic advantage to the children of those families. And ultimately, then that trickles into educational access when you're thinking about the best private schools and resources and programs. When you're thinking about access to being able to travel, right? There's some components of capital that's associated with being able to travel and see things differently from your own sphere of influence. And when you're thinking about some of the access to medical and health necessity in order to persist in society and access to certain things. So that's what I'm attending to when we're discussing a student's SES and wealth, or when we're talking about class and wealth. So occupation, what does that mean? When we're talking about occupation, and how does that align with the person's socioeconomic status? Well, generally speaking, We know that income is connected to a person's occupation, right? And income is also a fair measure of how we're making sense of occupational success. So there is importance in the occupation to society and also to one's skill set connected to that particular job. So we know that the type of job that one holds is going to be the primary determinant of the kind of income they're going to receive, right? But also relative to that is the occupational prestige associated with said occupations. That's oftentimes something that we don't really think about, and how that then translates into school spaces, right? Occupational prestige shows up time and time again, when we're thinking about how we make sense of who people are and how we make assumptions about people based off of that. It's determined by the requirements of the job and the characteristics that we've associated with that job as being better or less than. So when prestige of an occupation is higher, oftentimes what we see systemically is that there are fewer people that are able to gain access of entry into said occupation. So for example, as you're listening to me, you all are enrolled at the University of Florida. And hopefully as you graduate, you're striving to pursue a certain occupation or job. But there are individuals that didn't have access or opportunity to be able to ascribe to education, this level of educational attainment, which we'll talk about education in the next point, and thus might not have access to what you might be thinking or envisioning for your occupational goals, right? So if you've never went to undergrad or gotten your bachelor's degree, then you very well can't go to law school, and then you can't become a lawyer, right? But there are barriers to how people access certain levels of educational attainment, right? And so there's this stair step that has connection to how we have entry into certain aspects of occupation. And then when we get access to said occupation, then there's prestige associated with your ability to be connected to that and how people make sense of who you are and how they ultimately engage with you. When the prestige of an occupation is low, we also know that employees are allotted a lot less job security, and the income does not properly translate to what they get. And the accessibility to those with lower prestige occupations is greater. So there's more opportunity for those to access those occupations that are considered to have lower prestige. There's more spaces for individuals to go into those occupations. Very interesting how we make sense of how this takes place. Oftentimes I see, I've had students share with me about the experiences of their parents having certain occupations and the types of biases that educators have had in the exchange with their parents, because they make certain assumptions about who they are as a family and who the student is academically because of where they feel like the student might be based off of the occupation that they know the parent to be connected to. This is very, very common in educational spaces. And I kind of mentioned this a little bit, but we also know, and I guess can also make sense of how then we see education taking place and how assumptions and biases are perpetuated in SES, right? And thinking about it being a determinant of how we see this take place in student experience. We know that traditionally, if we're going back to our very first couple of slides, that education is supposed to be that thing that helps people move socially through our societal systems. It's often seen as a way to enhance one's economic status. However, educational credentials are more likely to be achieved as a result of family background, right? Access, right? The kinds of social and cultural capital that give you insight into thinking about how to navigate systems of education. Education is a system, an institution that people have to learn how to navigate. And depending on what you've had access to through social and cultural capital, from what you've learned from family members and communities that you're connected to, you may or may not know how to successfully maneuver educational institutions, right? And a student's socioeconomic origins have substantial influence into the amount and the type of schooling that you're going to be connected to, which in turn connects to the type of job that you can obtain. The conditions under which low-income students live often make it difficult for them to go to school And then ultimately their alternative is going to work, right? Because the conditions of how they're existing in connection to their income puts more emphasis on them needing more income in order to survive. And so they attribute to the importance of the income as the priority, and they have to make those types of decisions. Whereas if you're from a higher income identity, you don't have to make sense of having to push towards supporting family dynamic and income. And you can attend to all of your energies going towards educational aspirations and visions and goals, right? And dreams. Also, it's important to note that colleges that students attend are often influenced more by the SES of the family than honestly by the academic ability of the student. And this is connected to the notion that the access to capital that individuals have to learn how to navigate educational systems becomes how we see that translated into colleges and universities. And our students that have to make the decision of centering income for survival in social systems thus might very well and often have the academic ability that exceeds what we might assume, but they've had to weigh certain parts of their realities very differently. So they haven't been able to center in the same way. Or if they have, they exist and are schooling in spaces that are not properly supporting them. And so what's not being disrupted is the system, and what's being problematized is the student. Think about that deficit thinking video that we had in our announcements that talked about what deficit thinking is around how students are often problematized and not the systems that are perpetuating the realities of the students. So that's what I'm referencing when I'm thinking about, when I'm referencing deficit thinking. And so oftentimes I hear people talk about education as a way to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, as the way to move through climb the social ladder to pursue educational aspirations to climb this ladder. But how can you pull yourself up from your own bootstraps if you don't have any boots? Because everybody doesn't have boots. If we looked at the ways in which we've attended to income, who has wealth, who has income, and in what way, and who has access to certain components of capital, as we're attending to how students are engaged with occupational prestige and now educational accessibility. And the very last thing, as we're thinking about the 5 determinants of SES, is this connection to power. And so this is an extension of making sense of how we thought about it in our race and ethnicity module, and now as we attend to it in its connection to class. And so we know that individuals and families who are at the upper SES levels often hold and exert more of the power than those at any other level. So at this point, that should be very clear. We're talking about individuals from upper SES levels being the folks that are sitting on state and local policy boards, boards of colleges and universities, boards of corporations, right? Controlling any resources that ultimately influence the whole, the masses, right? And so it's important to be conscious around how this persists, not to problematize those that align or that are connected to upper SES levels, but to become aware and to know what is happening systemically, right? Wealth and affluence then, oftentimes, because we see such a small percentage, that 1% holding 1/3 of the nation's wealth, creating and persisting an uneven playing field for many students and parents, because they are on the boards and they are dictating what needs to happen, right? In what needs to be in place for their children without necessarily looking at what should be best for the majority. And you might see some cases, and there are definitely situations that I'm very aware of, where you see those with privilege negotiating their privilege to disrupt some of that to create a more equitable space. But we need to see that more happen more often so that we can attend to truly disrupting some of the systemic ways we've seen some of the challenges, particularly in educational spaces. And so we see, when we're thinking about wealth and affluence, children that are connected to those identities having the best access to the best teachers advanced placement courses, gifted and talented programs that sometimes are not in all schools, right? They're siloed in very specific places that only certain students have access to. And so this is connected to power and how we see this play itself out. This is also connected to power dynamic and teacher-student relationships, because teachers' biases play into students that we see coming from more affluent families or certain components of occupational prestige. And so they exert a power that suggests that those kids are seen in a very different light than students that come from the other side of the spectrum, as we're making sense of how this shows up. Very important for us to be conscious around how this perpetuates itself in our society. So then, now that we have all of these insights, now that we know about the determinants that make up SES, and why is this important as we move forward and as you work through this module, it's really to challenge us to think about how we might move towards that disruption, how we might move towards teaching for equity and being in educational spaces that aligns us with an equity framework. So rather than thinking about the provision of equal educational opportunity, we need to be thinking about more equitable provisions for educational experiences that acknowledge the perpetuation of some of the existing social and economic inequities that we see in society. And I want to make sure at this point to differentiate between equality and equity. So equality suggests that everyone gets the exact same thing. And the tensions around the use of equality, and where you might see some folks toggling between the use of equality and equity, is that in the current state of where we systemically are and historically how we now know communities have experienced their educational histories, we're not all starting at the same playing field. So to suggest equality would suggest that we're not going to acknowledge the historical ramifications of how we see inequities persisting. So the language of equity suggests that we acknowledge the historical barriers that have been in place for communities, and divert our attention to acknowledging and supporting those communities that have had to navigate those issues. So as we're thinking about 4 areas that can influence inequities in schools, we're going to talk about teacher expectations, tracking, curriculum, and funding. What do I mean when I talk about teacher expectations? I'm talking about first becoming more aware, which I'm hoping that you're getting as you're working through this module, around how these systems persist and how these critical issues have sustained themselves for a very long time, right? But being able to overcome the stigma of poverty and issues connected to class, as we're talking about teaching expectations, there's a priority of consciously reviewing how you're engaging with your students, particularly as we're attending to the ways in which we might have embraced some of these components of SES, the determinants of SES, and how we engage in the spaces that we're in, the educational spaces that we're connected to. Many students are extremely resilient despite the conditions and the obstacles that they're in. And oftentimes, we need to realize that we need to disrupt and problematize the systems and not the experiences of the students in our expectations. Teachers, counselors, and administrators can often unconsciously fall into the behaviors that fault the individual. That is what I'm referencing when I'm talking about deficit thinking or deficit thought, right? We immediately position the experiences of minoritized communities from deficit positioning. And that oftentimes has implications on how we engage with those individuals. And what we should be doing is looking more systemically at what is happening and why we see those realities for those communities and problematizing that. That would shift us from blaming the students, blaming the families, blaming the communities for failure, and push us towards a space where we're really challenging and examining the systems, and also kind of critically self-reflecting on our own teaching practices, right? Those types of effective teachers are making the difference in the classrooms. Also, we need to think about tracking and how we see that. You'll do some reading in this module around tracking by Jenny Oakes. and what that means, and how hard it is oftentimes when we track students based off of class ability, and how we're making sense of their SES. And then oftentimes it's hard for students to break out of where they've been tracked. We see that as students are placed into different groups and classes based off of not only not their intellectual ability oftentimes, but just where a teacher thinks they might be most successful. And if where a teacher suggests where they might be more successful is biased because we haven't been consciously in tune with components of class identity in some of these ways that we see implicitly and explicitly in student experience, we start to see some of the disproportionality of large numbers of students from lower SES identities assigned to lower ability groups, and those from upper ability groups being the only folks that are tracked into the gifted programs, the honors programs, the IB programs, etc. Think back to your own experiences of how you saw that take place. And so it's not often connected to intellectual ability, because you have students that might come from wealthier backgrounds whose parents have used their power to ensure that their kids are in a particular program, whether or not their child is intellectually able to participate in those spaces, right? Because their parents have the influence to ensure their child are in those spaces. And so students that come from lower SES identities or lower SES levels have to navigate very different realities. And oftentimes those families often don't know that they can push back on systems where their kids are excluded from gifted and honors programs. They don't know how to navigate some of the ways that we work through educational spaces for their students to have access to particular resources, or they're in schooling spaces that don't have those programs. And so they're completely left out of the opportunity for their kids to be connected to that. And also we see, when we're thinking about tracking, some of the more experienced and successful teachers being disproportionately assigned to the higher ability groups. I've had students share in their educational histories that they would have whole classes where they just didn't learn anything. They were just placed either in a gym, they were said to go outside and sit on the bleachers, and they would be academic courses where they just weren't engaged in the same way, because often either they didn't have a teacher assigned to that course, or maybe the teachers were even overloaded, right? With other expectations, and they're being said to have to manage academic content areas that are not their expertise, but they're being assigned to them based off of their the schooling needs, right, and the demand. And so what does that ultimately mean for what access a student might be able to connect to? So thinking about moving that towards curricula for equity oriented practice. So as we're tending to teaching expectations, as we're thinking about the ways in which we know tracking to take place, we also have to think about how we unpack and think about the curriculum that exists in schools. What textbooks are being used, what values and experiences are being centered and kind of highlighted as the way that we should ascribe to and identify with. Oftentimes, if you think about curriculum and textbooks, it's typically focusing on the values and experiences solely of those from the middle class. And it highlights our heroes as being capitalistic, as participating in political systems, which are primarily white spaces or white identities from economically privileged families. So those are the folks that are highlighted in much of the curriculum. And so you see no representation of working class families and what it means to work through and overcome and to be resilient, right? You don't see representation of that in our curriculum. You don't hear narratives like that. And so students don't see themselves in what it is that they're studying. You don't see that varied connection to income, right? And occupational prestige, right? The varying components of identity. And because you don't see that, you don't connect with how you are visually represented in the types of learning that you're experiencing. And because students learn from their existence in these spaces. And oftentimes that learning is heightened when they can connect to those realities. And so it's extremely important as we're thinking about an equity orientation in our curriculum, in our expectations, and in our engagement with students, that we're attending to how that shows up. And that we are not living in a middle class myth where everyone ascribes to be the highlighted heroes that we're traditionally seeing in our textbooks, right? We need to diversify who's represented and in what ways so that everyone can feel seen in what it is that they're learning. And the very last thing to attend to as you move through this module is to think about school funding, which has a huge part in how students have access to certain resources and how we make sense of really thinking about inequities in education. School funding is going to be at the root, at the core of some of that. Education is financed by local, state, and federal resources. But primarily that money is coming from local and state distributions, somewhere about 43.5 or 48.3% respectively, right? Federal support is substantially less. And so that local and state support is connected oftentimes to property taxes being the communities that you live in, the taxes that you pay on the property that you live in, ultimately is considered a primary source for the local funding of the schools. This is a huge part of the disparities that we see in education that exists from one community to another. And because we see the funding distributions of schools made out in this way, there's oftentimes huge challenges and difference in how we see the experiences of high income families versus those from low income families. Because we know that communities with high income identities, they're going to ultimately generate much more property tax in the homes that they live in that will go towards the types of schools that their kids experience. And those that come from low income communities will ultimately also have the latter. They won't have as high of property taxes that are contributing to the types of funding supports that are present in their schools. This is a huge issue that as you continue to move throughout all of these modules in this course that you'll see persistent as you're even reflecting back on your own experiences with schools, that has to be acknowledged and disrupted in some way if we truly want to embody and embrace an equity framework in education. That is all for our introduction and talk around class, socioeconomic status, and schools. Enjoy the module as you move through your assignments. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out to your instructor.